My name is Elena, and if you had met me on the morning when this all quietly began, you would not have seen a woman on the brink of some glowing transformation. You would have seen someone standing barefoot on a cold kitchen floor, staring at a sink full of dishes she had promised herself she would wash the night before, listening to the hum of an old refrigerator that seemed to breathe heavier than she did, wondering how something as invisible as money could feel so heavy in the chest, pressing behind the ribs like a second heart that only knew how to ache. The house was still, the sky outside the window barely lifting itself from grey to pale silver, and the phone on the counter lay face down, not because I was trying to be mindful, but because I already knew what it would say if I turned it over. Another reminder, another polite warning, another number that didn't care how hard I had tried to stretch what was left of the month into something that looked like survival. And in that quiet, I felt a strange kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleep, the kind that comes from feeling as though your life has been shrinking into lists and deadlines and whispered apologies to yourself. The kind that makes you realize you have been holding your breath for weeks without noticing. It was in that moment, with the kettle forgotten on the stove and a thin line of steam curling up like a ghost that didn't want to be seen, that I remembered the folded scrap of paper tucked into the back pocket of my wallet, the one I had almost thrown away because it looked unimportant, the one that carried a few simple lines written in ink that had faded at the edges. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could survive being crumpled and flattened and forgotten, while I felt as though I was barely holding my own shape together. My fingers were a little unsteady when I pulled it out, not from fear exactly, but from the tired kind of hope that doesn't want to be disappointed again. And I smoothed it on the counter as if it were more fragile than it really was, reading the words slowly, letting them land in me without trying to argue with them, noticing how they didn't promise fireworks or instant relief, but something quieter, something almost humble. And for the first time in a long while, I felt my shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, as though my body recognized a gentler rhythm before my mind did. The room seemed to breathe with me. The ticking clock sounded less like a countdown and more like a companion, and even the pale light through the window felt kinder, as if it were not rushing me to be anything other than exactly where I was. And in that stillness, a small thought rose that didn't feel like desperation, but like an invitation to try, to trust a little, to give myself permission to believe that not every turning point has to arrive with noise and spectacle, that some of them slip into your life quietly while you're standing in your kitchen, half awake, wondering how you will make it through another day. And I stood there holding that small piece of paper as if it were a key I didn't yet know how to use, feeling something loosen inside my chest, not enough to call it peace, but enough to call it possible, enough to sense that the story I thought I was trapped inside might be softer at the edges than I had believed, and that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a different way of walking forward, even if I couldn't yet see where the path would lead. There was a time when the word heavy no longer described just my body at the end of a long day, but my entire existence, as if every hour I lived was being quietly loaded onto my back without my permission, and I carried it because I did not know how to set it down. Mornings began with a strange tightness in my throat before my eyes were even fully open, and nights ended with my mind racing through numbers that refused to settle into anything kind or reasonable, the ceiling becoming my silent witness as I lay there calculating what could be delayed, what could be negotiated, and what I would have to pretend not to see for another week, and somewhere between those restless nights and anxious mornings, my sense of safety began to thin out like fabric that had been washed too many times. I remember standing in grocery aisles, staring at price tags as if they were riddles written in a language I no longer understood, my hand hovering over shelves while my thoughts performed quiet math, subtracting comfort from necessity, subtracting joy from survival, leaving me with baskets that felt as empty as the promises I kept making to myself about next month. And every beep at the register felt like a reminder that time itself had become something I owed. I stopped answering unknown numbers, not because I was busy, but because my heart could not take the way my stomach dropped when I imagined what waited on the other end of the line. And I began to measure my days not by sunlight or laughter or conversations, but by deadlines and due dates, as if my life had been reduced to a series of invisible contracts I could never quite fulfill. Even my reflection seemed different, my eyes carrying a tiredness that makeup could not hide, my smile becoming something I practiced rather than something that happened, and I noticed how my shoulders stayed slightly raised all the time, as if I were bracing myself for an impact that never came but was always expected. Conversations with friends became careful, selective, and quiet, because I did not know how to explain the kind of stress that lives under your skin, the kind that makes you flinch at kindness and distrust good news. And I began to feel as though I was slowly shrinking, folding myself smaller so that I would not take up space, so that I would not have to ask for help, so that no one would see how close I felt to the edge of something I could not name. There were moments when I would sit alone in my car long after parking, staring at the steering wheel while my chest tightened with thoughts I could not silence, wondering how something as invisible as money could dictate the rhythm of my breathing, and how I had arrived at a place where simply getting through the day felt like a victory. Yet even in that wait, there were quiet sparks of awareness, fleeting and fragile, little realizations that whispered I was not broken, that maybe my life was not failing, but asking me to listen differently, that perhaps what I was carrying was not meant to be permanent. And although I did not yet know how to put it down, I could feel deep inside that something in me was beginning to question the story I had been telling myself about what was possible. The first time I spoke it, I didn't prepare myself the way I thought people were supposed to prepare for sacred things. There were no candles lit in perfect symmetry, no calming music floating through the room, no carefully chosen moment that felt worthy of something ancient and powerful. There was only the quiet hum of my apartment settling into the evening, the faint orange glow of a lamp in the corner, and me sitting on the edge of my bed with my phone resting face down beside my thigh, as if even its silent presence felt too loud. And I remember how my hands rested in my lap, palms open without me consciously deciding to do that, as though my body already understood that this was not about holding on, but about allowing. And when I finally lifted the small paper again and let my eyes move across the lines, my voice came out softer than I expected, almost unsure of itself, the words slipping into the room like cautious guests who did not want to disturb anything fragile. I stumbled over a phrase at first, then paused, then started again, and in that pause I noticed my breathing, how shallow it had become without my realizing it, how my chest felt tight, as if it had been bracing for disappointment even in this. And as I continued, something subtle shifted. Not in the room, but inside me, like the moment when a clenched fist finally loosens without being told to, and I felt a warmth spread slowly through my ribs, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, just present. I was surprised by how grounded I felt, as if my feet were suddenly heavier against the floor, as if my spine had remembered how to sit up straight without tension, and I found myself reading more slowly, not because I was trying to make it meaningful, but because each line seemed to invite me to linger, to actually hear what I was saying rather than rushing through it the way I rushed through so many other things in my life. There was a quiet honesty in that moment, a strange intimacy between me and my own voice, and for the first time in a long while I wasn't mentally calculating, worrying, or planning my next step while standing in the present. I was simply there, breathing, speaking, existing without trying to fix anything. When the last word left my lips, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something unseen had settled gently into the space around me. And I stayed there longer than I intended, listening to the faint sounds of the building, to my own heartbeat, to the soft rhythm of air moving in and out of my lungs, feeling a calm that did not demand explanations or guarantees. I didn't feel like my problems had vanished, but I did feel like they had loosened their grip on my chest, and that alone felt extraordinary, as though a window had been cracked open in a room that had been closed for too long, letting in a thin line of air that reminded me what breathing deeply felt like, and I realized, without needing to say it out loud, that something had begun to change in me, not with noise, not with promises, but with a quiet sense of being gently held by a rhythm I could return to again. After that first evening, life did not suddenly rearrange itself into something neat and generous. There were no dramatic phone calls or sudden windfalls that made me laugh out loud in disbelief, but something softer began to weave its way into my days, something that felt more like a quiet current than a crashing wave. And I noticed it first in the way my mornings felt less rushed, as though my body no longer woke up already bracing for bad news, my shoulders lowering a little when my feet touched the floor, my breath finding a calmer rhythm before my thoughts had time to spiral into their usual lists of worries. The psalm became part of my routine in such a natural way that I sometimes forgot how new it still was. Spoken once a day with the same gentle consistency as brushing my teeth or opening the curtains. And with that steadiness came a subtle change in how I looked at my circumstances, my eyes lingering less on what was missing and more on what was quietly working, like a delayed payment that finally went through without explanation, or a small refund that appeared in my account like a whisper of reassurance. And I would find myself staring at my phone, not in shock, but in a thoughtful stillness, as if my life was softly clearing its throat to let me know it was still listening. My mind began to settle in ways I had not experienced in a long time, the constant hum of anxiety lowering its volume just enough for me to hear my own thoughts again. And in that quieter space, I made better decisions, not driven by panic or urgency, but by a strange, newfound patience that surprised me, as if something inside me had finally learned that it was allowed to pause before reacting. I noticed how my sleep deepened, how I woke up less often in the middle of the night, how my dreams became gentler, filled with light and movement instead of endless corridors and locked doors, and even my body seemed to respond, my jaw unclenching, my posture softening, my hands less likely to curl into fists without me noticing. Small conversations began to shift too, a friend reaching out just to check in, an old acquaintance mentioning an opportunity in passing, nothing that felt miraculous on its own, but together forming a quiet pattern of doors that did not feel so firmly shut anymore, and with each of these subtle changes, my heart grew a little steadier, my fear losing some of its sharp edges. I found myself smiling more easily, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because the heaviness that had once colored every moment was slowly thinning, leaving room for lighter thoughts, for laughter that felt genuine rather than forced, for the simple pleasure of standing in my kitchen with a cup of tea and feeling present instead of pressured. And although I did not yet fully understand what was happening or where it was leading, I could feel my life shifting its weight, as if it were learning a new balance, one that did not demand constant struggle, one that allowed space for breath, for hope, for the quiet belief that things were beginning to move in a kinder direction. I remember the first day I realized the debts were beginning to loosen, not in some dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quietest, almost imperceptible moments, the ones that only hit you after weeks of careful attention. I was sitting at my small wooden desk, the one scarred with coffee rings and late-night notes, staring at a spreadsheet that had once been a source of panic, each number like a weight pressing down on my chest. But this time, something felt different. I could look at the rows of balances and due dates without that tightness in my throat, without the familiar sinking feeling that there would never be enough. It was as if the numbers themselves had softened, or maybe it was me who had finally softened, and I realized that clarity was slowly replacing the chaos, a patient, deliberate kind of clarity that allowed me to see the gaps where solutions might exist. The first sign came with a small, overlooked refund from a bill I had long assumed was gone forever. It arrived unexpectedly in my bank account, a quiet nudge that whispered, "This is possible." I remember pausing, staring at the screen as if it might vanish if I didn't watch it long enough. Then came a phone call from a client I hadn't spoken to in months, a casual message about a payment that had been delayed, finally sent. It was not a windfall, not by any means, but each of these small shifts began to accumulate, creating a rhythm of movement that felt entirely different from the stagnant fear I had been living in. I started to feel that strange, buoyant sensation of possibility, that unspoken confidence that the universe, or whatever force was holding me upright, was quietly working with me rather than against me. I noticed the way my anxiety began to loosen its grip as well. Where I had once lain awake at night, turning over every conceivable worst-case scenario, I now found myself able to think through solutions without being consumed by dread. I could make calls, write emails, organize what was owed with a calm I had thought impossible. My mind, once a tight coil of tension, had begun to unwind, and in that unwinding, the world started to feel less like a trap and more like a space where I could breathe and plan and act. Even interactions with others began to shift. A neighbor offered to pick up groceries when I mentioned being short on time. A friend mentioned a resource I hadn't considered, a side gig that could help cover a gap. I didn't take all of it at once, but the gestures, small and unassuming, began to build a subtle network of support that I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I stopped feeling like I was trapped under a mountain of debt. Instead, I began to see it as a series of steps, each one manageable if I approached it with the quiet discipline I had been cultivating through the psalm, spoken once a day with the intention of letting life, rather than panic, guide me. Money didn't rush in dramatically, and there were still tight moments, still challenges that tested my patience and faith, but there was a new rhythm now, one that allowed me to meet my obligations without the crushing dread that had once defined me. What had once felt like chains around my chest had loosened enough for me to breathe, to think, to act, and even to hope. And in that breathing space, I began to notice the subtle miracles that had been there all along, quietly returning to me, not with fanfare, but with a gentle insistence that what was lost could indeed come home again. By the time I settled into the new rhythm, it had become less of a conscious effort and more of a quiet current that carried me through the days. The psalm, once a fragile experiment, had become a steady companion, spoken once each morning with the same gentleness I gave my first cup of coffee or the soft stretch of my arms before leaving the bed. There was no hurry, no pressure to repeat it for effect, no frantic hoping that the universe would notice me, only the calm awareness that I was aligning myself with something bigger than my own anxieties, something patient, something that moved in its own time. I noticed how my steps through the day began to feel lighter, not because my circumstances had suddenly shifted dramatically, but because I had shifted inside them, my heart learning a new tempo that made each decision feel more deliberate, more grounded, more like a choice rather than a reaction. I began to notice abundance in places I had overlooked before. A friend's offer to share leftover food, a small unexpected tip, a bonus from work that felt like a silent affirmation. I began to recognize these as signals of movement, the universe nudging gently rather than pushing, and I welcomed them with gratitude that was quieter than celebration but deeper than relief. Money no longer felt like a scarce, pressing force that haunted my every thought. It became a visitor that returned when I was ready to receive it, in its own timing, without manipulation or begging. The panic that had once defined my mornings had softened into a patient curiosity. What might today hold? What small door might open quietly, inviting me to step through without fear? Even my internal dialogue changed. I stopped beating myself up for missteps or for days when nothing seemed to move. I stopped framing life in terms of scarcity and failure and instead began observing it, noticing the patterns that were emerging through consistency and gentle attention. I could feel my body relaxing into a trust I hadn't known I was capable of, a trust that was not naive but measured, grounded in repeated experience rather than blind hope. When I faced bills, responsibilities, or the lingering anxieties of my past, I no longer met them with dread, but with a quiet determination, a sense that there was space for solutions, for grace, for patience. Even the small rhythms of daily life felt richer, sharper, more alive. I noticed the sunlight on my countertop in a way I hadn't before, the texture of my morning tea, the softness of a sheet when I sank into bed at night. There was a sense of presence that had been absent for years, a gentle awareness that life was not merely something to survive, but something to inhabit fully, moment by moment, breath by breath. Each day became a practice of noticing, of returning, of trusting that the small gestures of faith, the psalm spoken once, the deliberate pauses, the patient attention, were creating shifts that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. And in that rhythm, I began to sense a flow in my relationships, my work, and my own heart. Decisions felt steadier, conversations clearer, boundaries stronger. I was no longer reaching desperately for security or validation, but instead moving through my life with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that discipline, patience, and a single daily act of devotion could create a momentum far greater than frantic striving ever could. The rhythm carried me, and I carried it too, each feeding the other, a gentle cycle of trust and movement that began to color every part of my days with a sense of possibility, of balance, and of hope. Even now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching my windows, I feel the story of my life still unfolding in ways I cannot fully predict. It is strange the way change works. Not as a sudden eruption that demands attention, but as a careful, almost imperceptible weaving of moments that, only in hindsight, reveal the pattern that has been forming all along. I have learned that life does not rush to answer prayers in the way we imagine. It does not sweep in with dramatic gestures or force our hands to grasp what we think we need. It moves in whispers, in small openings, in the spaces we do not notice while we are too busy fearing, too busy struggling, too busy doubting. And in the stillness I have cultivated, in the single daily repetition of something sacred, something ancient, I have found a power that is neither loud nor showy, but relentless in its quiet insistence. I remember the nights when I could barely sleep, when my mind replayed every misstep, every unpaid bill, every moment of doubt that made me feel unworthy of abundance. Those nights were long, endless, filled with shadows that pressed against my chest like invisible weights. And yet, even in that darkness, there was a spark that refused to go out, a spark that whispered of resilience, of possibility, of a hidden current flowing beneath the chaos. It took patience, unmeasurable, unglamorous patience, to notice it, to honor it, to let it grow into something tangible. And now I recognize that spark as a force in my life, a force that does not ask for my frantic attention, but waits for my steady presence, for the gentle dedication of a daily act, for the trust that comes from speaking a psalm once every day, without rushing, without bargaining, without fear. What I have discovered is that abundance is not a result of desperation. It is not the product of frantic effort, nor is it the reward of wishing too hard for something that feels forever beyond reach. Abundance arrives when we align ourselves with the quiet rhythm of our own faith, when we release the notion that we must force life to bend to our timeline, when we recognize that everything we think is lost is often only waiting for us to be ready to receive it. There is a strange power in patience, in repetition, in the unwavering consistency of one small sacred act performed each day. It begins to ripple outward, affecting every corner of our lives, our relationships, our decisions, our sense of self, our capacity to trust. I have felt the weight lift in ways I never thought possible, yet I am still learning, still noticing, still breathing into the spaces that fear once occupied. There are mornings when the rhythm is easier, and there are mornings when doubt creeps in like a cold wind through a cracked door, testing whether I have truly learned the lesson of steady faith. And every time it comes, I remind myself that the process is ongoing, that the story is still being written, that the psalm is not a magic spell, but a compass, pointing me toward alignment, toward clarity, toward the life that waits for me if I continue to meet it with quiet consistency and courage. Now I sit with these reflections, aware that the narrative is far from complete, aware that each day carries a new page, a fresh moment to practice trust, patience, and openness. I am no longer chasing miracles. I am witnessing them in the smallest gestures, in the subtle shifts, in the return of what I thought was lost. And in this recognition, I realize that life has not been waiting for me to fix it. It has been waiting for me to show up fully, to honor the rhythm, to speak once a day, the words that carry more power than I could have imagined. So I ask you, if you were standing in my place, feeling the weight of what seems insurmountable, seeing the debts and the losses that press against your chest, hearing the quiet hum of life moving around you while you wonder if you can ever catch up, would you speak the words, even once every single day, and trust that the momentum they create will be enough? Would you allow yourself to notice the subtle currents, to follow the openings that appear almost imperceptibly, to meet abundance on its own terms rather than demanding it on yours? Could you surrender the fear long enough to witness what begins to return when you finally align yourself with the quiet rhythm of faith? This story is still being written, and yet its echoes are already present. The question is no longer if it will end well, but whether you have the courage to start writing your own chapter in the same deliberate, steady, unwavering way. The answer, if you dare to speak it, waits in the silence, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be claimed, waiting for you to step into the rhythm and let life respond.